From the campus of the University of Nebraska at Omaha, consider this with Cathy Wyatt, a program of issues and information behind today's news.
This is one of the most significant decisions on presidential power in decades. The Supreme Court, just moments ago, in a 6-3 decision authored by Chief Justice John Roberts, invalidated most of President Trump's tariffs. 70% of the tariffs he's imposed so far in his second term here have been under the law known as the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. It was written in 1977. He claimed it gave him unlimited power to tariff any country at any level for as long as he wants. And Roberts said the law simply does not give him that authority. Congress, under the Constitution, has the power to tax Americans, collect tariffs. There's no mention of tariffs in that law, and the Supreme Court said he cannot do what he's done.
I'm ashamed of certain members of the court, absolutely ashamed, for not having the courage to do what's right for our country.
Hi everyone, I'm Cathy Wyatt. Welcome to the 29th season and this week's edition of Consider This. Our topic, the state of U.S. tariffs. Joining us to talk more about it are Carson Holloway, professor and department chair in political science at UNO, and Ernie Goss, McAllister chair and professor of economics at Creighton University. Thank you both so much for being here and welcome.
Thanks, Cathy.
Thanks, Cathy.
Carson, I want to start with you. Tell us about the case before the Supreme Court.
Sure. The case was called Learning Resources Incorporated versus Trump, President of the United States, and it arose in response to the tariffs that the president has imposed in his first year in office, or many of them. And as I think most of the viewers know, President Trump thinks that tariffs are an important part of his approach to international trade and foreign policy. Likes to use them to get leverage over other countries and to renegotiate trade arrangements with them in ways that he thinks are more advantageous for the United States. But a tariff or a duty is kind of a tax on a foreign good, on an import, and the Constitution gives Congress the power to impose taxes, not the president. Or alternatively, you could look at a tariff as a way to regulate trade with foreign nations, but that power too is given by the Constitution to the Congress, not to the president. So how could he do it? He couldn't do it on his own authority, constitutionally alone, right? He couldn't do it under, say, Article 2 of the Constitution. If he had a power to do it, it would have to be under some statute that Congress has enacted that gives him some authority to do so, and that's what he was claiming under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977. That law does give the president certain substantial powers to regulate imports into the United States, and the Trump administration was claiming that you could infer or imply a power to lay the tariffs from that law.
Okay. Friday, February 20th, the justices make a major ruling. What happened?
Well, the litigants in this case, or the ones who brought the suit, denied that the president had this power under the act in question, and the court agreed with them, or at least the majority of the court agreed with those who brought the suit. Chief Justice John Roberts wrote an opinion representing his view, as well as the views of three of the conservative justices on the court, including himself, and then also the three liberals on the court, holding that the president did not have the authority to do this under this particular statute. And the argument's pretty straightforward. The law that I mentioned earlier, the IEEPA, does give the president some substantial powers, some very serious powers to regulate imports if he invokes a national emergency under the National Emergencies Act, which he did. But it doesn't mention tariffs, right? It's basically a kind of question of textual statutory interpretation. The powers listed do not include tariffs, and the majority thought, we don't think it's reasonable to imply tariffs under the powers that are listed. There's a power to regulate imports, and the president was claiming that that would imply a right to levy tariffs as well. The court's view was more like, well, power to regulate often does include a right to include tariff, or it does include tariffs, but we think Congress would have specified that if they intended that to be included, and they didn't, so we don't think you have the power. I think the court was also concerned with the scope of the power that was being claimed. The president did claim under that law a power to levy as much tariffs as he thought necessary on any country, on any import, for the duration that he thought was necessary, and I think that the court thought that was just too much, given the lack of clarity of the language. They didn't want to imply that much power in the president.
This involved a legal philosophy that the court ruled in Biden versus Nebraska in 2023. What happened there?
Very good. That's a very interesting part of this case, I think, the legal background, which involves what is called the major questions doctrine. And the major questions doctrine is an approach that has been developed, especially in recent years, and especially by the conservative justices on the court, to deal with cases just like this, where the executive or an executive branch agency is claiming some major regulatory power under a law that does not grant that power explicitly, but the administration is saying it's implied by the language of the statute. And so there's several cases we could talk about that are all pretty recently. One was West Virginia versus EPA in 2022, where somebody had challenged an old Obama-era regulation regulating, the scope of coal plants under the Clean Air Act, kind of an expansive reading of the language there, and the court said, can't do that. Another one involved vaccine mandate that the Biden administration had under the Occupational Safety and Health Act, and the court said that's too broad of a reading of the statutory language. And then in Biden versus Nebraska, the issue was President Biden's cancellation of student loan debt under statutory language that gave him or his people who report to him the power to waive certain statutory or regulatory requirements surrounding the loans. And again, in all those cases, the court had said, well, that's too much of a reach given the lack of clarity of the statutory language. So the major questions doctrine is the name of the doctrine that the court's developed to deal with cases just like this one and the ones I just discussed, where the executive branch is claiming kind of the legal basis for a major regulatory or policy move where it's not explicitly granted.
Okay. Justice Gorsuch called out his conservative colleagues who dissented in their apparent double standard on this legal doctrine. Thoughts?
Yeah, I wouldn't want to say that he was necessarily calling them out in particular, or maybe not even calling anybody out if we mean anything too confrontational by that. I took a look at that opinion, Justice Gorsuch's concurring opinion. It's kind of scholarly in its character. I think he wants to just nail down all the subtleties of the major questions doctrine and show that he's got the best grip on it or that his approach to it is the correct one. Because he does really respond to everybody who wrote a separate opinion. Not only the conservative dissenters, but also the liberal concurrers, as well as Justice Barrett, another conservative who wrote a concurring opinion. So if he's calling people out, if you want to put it that way, you could say that he's calling out the conservative justices by saying, well, you weren't willing to grant a very expansive executive power to Biden in these earlier cases. How come you're willing to give Trump more running room? But then equally, he's saying to the liberal justices like Kagan and Sotomayor and Jackson, well, if you were willing to negate the president's power in this case, when it's Trump, why weren't you willing to do it in those earlier cases? And it really gets into complicated questions of statutory language and interpretation of statutory language. And the major questions doctrine and who's got the best interpretation of that. Some justices agree with it, some don't. Some think you can just do this on the basis of regular statutory interpretation without invoking the doctrine. And so he's trying to respond to everybody equally across the board and clarify things there.
So what does a decision like this mean then for Congress moving forward?
That's a very good question. I think an opinion like this or a ruling like this is an invitation to Congress to modify the scope of the powers that it's given to the president if they want to. I think it's important to remember that the case does not say that Congress could not delegate vast powers to the president to impose tariffs. It just says that the law that he invoked does not do that. So it depends on who you are in the Congress and what you think is the right approach. If somebody thought that the ruling improperly constrains the president's powers, they could revise the law to give him the power in clearer terms. Or if they're okay with the scope of the powers under what the court has done, they just leave it alone. Or someone might think that even though the court properly constrained the president's powers under this act, they might think that the powers given under the act are still too broad, and then in that case they could argue for repealing the act or revising it to constrain the powers. So all those things are open to Congress. I kind of doubt that they'll do anything with it because it's hard to get a majority, especially with the Senate filibuster, to revise any language in any statute that exists. But those are things they could do if they thought the court was wrong in its interpretation of the law.
Okay. Ernie, I want to ask you, what is all of this doing to President Trump's economic and foreign policy?
Well, I I wrote a piece that appeared in Substack and Twitter and X and other avenues, and I titled it "The Supreme Court Saves President Trump from Himself," and that was on the Friday. And of course, he then did he, in my view, made a significant mistake by saying, well, I'm going to add 10% all tariffs across the board, which in my view is a mistake. Then he changed it to 15%. The idea is that the crazy, in my view, crazy, and this is a mercantilist view, comes from the 18th and 19th century global economy, that somehow a trade deficit is bad for your economy. Well, guess what? The U.S. has been running a trade deficit since 1971, and we've led the globe in terms of economic growth. So if it's so darn bad, why has it not shown up in the data? And it hasn't. In fact, give you this one, since the president's tariffs were implemented, the deficit has really not gone down by probably less than 0.5% since he implemented the tariffs. So really the deficit has not gone down, and that really is not a factor. And to your question about the economy, what was it do to the economy? If he would give the economy some certainty, let's quit monkeying with all this. I mean, I appreciate this constitutional language and this and that and the other. The real bottom line is we need to get to business, which means we need to open the economy up, which means that we cannot do what we've been doing for the past, since January the 20th of last year. And that means opening up the economy and understand if trade surplus, China runs a surplus, how darn good is that for their economy? Their consumers, 45% of their economy is consumption. Ours is 67%. In other words, we do marvelously much better than the Chinese as consumers. So if you want to implement what I view as a mistake, which is trying to run a surplus or reducing the trade deficit, well, the best way to do that is go into recession. We've gone into recession that reduces the trade deficit. Hasn't gotten rid of it, it reduces it. So why, and by the way, our economy grew at 1.4% in the fourth quarter of 2025. So not good. That was down from the third quarter, the growth. So growth is moving in the wrong direction. And in my view, it's moving in the wrong direction to a large degree due to the uncertainty from tariffs. This is a lot of uncertainty to the businesses and to individuals out there that are trying to produce and trying to consume, and you have so much uncertainty which is introduced by these tariffs. And so I would say the president, let's get rid of them. This is no time for the ego get in the way of the economy, and I fear that may be it. Now I'm saying this, I voted for President Trump 3 times. I support most of his policies, not this one. And this is a major policy. It's a backbone of his policy. He said the voters voted for me. Well, that may well be good, but not every voter understands that trade deficits are not necessarily a big negative.
I think, Ernie, viewers who are watching may be wondering what has been to date. What have these tariffs brought in, and where's the money going to go? Well,
they've not brought in that much money. They've increased the price of products. By the way, there's this idea that, well, now the president, his administration, has to pay back these tariffs. Well, who do you pay it back to? Who paid it? The consumer, the businesses? Who paid the tariffs? So the idea that it can simply, well, you got $170 billion in tariffs. Okay, give it back to the businesses? No, maybe the consumers should get it back. Who should? Maybe the transportation companies should get it back. Who gets that money back? I think it would be a big mistake. The Supreme Court did not rule on that very issue, nor should they, in my judgment. We should just move on and take the licking that we got, that the administration got, and move on with certainty. This economy could be unleashed It's being held back by tariffs. It's being held back by uncertainty. This is not hard to figure out. I mean, you don't have to be an economist to see what's been going on, and it has not been good.
I wanted to ask you, just days after the ruling, U.S. importers were still paying Trump's illegal tariffs. Can you explain why?
I would assume it's required. I mean, it's not like you say, well, I'm not going to pay this, then you're not going to get, your product is not coming in. I mean, these are bureaucrats that are still abiding by the last, and that's a legal issue, a political issue. I'm hands off of that. I'm an economist. I'm commenting on economics, and I'm telling you, the tariffs have been not good for this economy.
So one of the other questions that have come up is these foreign deals that are kind of, in the works right now.
Yes.
So with all of this happening and all of this shaking out, what happens to those deals that are what they're calling in progress?
Well, what they should do is abandon them all. I mean, this you say, well, if you, for example, Bolsonaro in Brazil, you put him in prison or whatever, you tariff that nation. That's too arbitrary. We're talking about men and women across the globe that are trying making economic decisions. You're thinking, well, what did I have to do with that? I'm just a business person here in Brazil, and I want to do business with the U.S. I mean, look what it did to agriculture, Cathy. I mean, you're talking about the retaliation. I'm talking about retaliation. Retaliation, we saw it. China's imports of U.S. Agriculture and livestock, their Chinese imports of our agriculture and livestock declined by 85 to 90%. You think that was not felt by the Nebraska farmer? It was felt heavily, and that punished the economy. And now you've seen we're now distributing $11 to $12 billion to the agricultural sector because they were hurt by the tariffs. Well, they're not the only ones that were hurt by the tariffs. This economy was hurt by the tariffs.
Let me ask you, Carson, when it comes to these tariffs, any way now you think that they can survive?
Well, there are alternative statutes under which the president can impose tariffs where it's clear in the statutory language that he can do so. I think, and I'm not an expert on trade legislation, but I think it's a little tougher to do it under some of the other statutes, that there are more procedural requirements. Some of them require the president to do an investigation into whether there's unfair trading practices and things like that. So I think it remains to be seen. Certainly the administration thinks they have other legal bases on which to do it, and I expect that they will try to do it. As Ernie said, I don't think the president's changing course. He'll just find other laws to use.
Okay, all right.
And look, are we going to punish China for selling us cheap goods? These jeans I have on, or these slacks I have on, I paid I shouldn't say this, I paid $16 at Walmart for them. A darn good deal, and I'm grateful for that. I mean, and the fact is, we sell them other products. In other words, it's the law of comparative advantage. We produce what we have a comparative advantage in. They produce what we have a comparative disadvantage. We trade medical equipment for bananas. We trade medical equipment for cheap toys from China. That's how it works, and it works well.
I want to let viewers know we're recording this program just hours before President Trump's State of the Union address to Congress. Carson, what do you think his message is going to be?
Well, I don't think his message will be markedly different from what it always is. I mean, President Trump often says surprising things off the cuff, but his general themes are pretty much the same from the time he started running for office up until now. So I expect he will continue to emphasize the same themes, maybe give an update on what he thinks is progress toward achieving them, call upon Congress to enact new legislation to help him move things forward. But I don't expect he'll radically change direction. I mean, sometimes presidents do use the State of the Union for a reset and go in a radically new direction. I don't think President Trump's going to do that. On this specific issue, one could ask, will he call out the court to its face if they're in attendance for making a mistake, in his mind, in this ruling? It would not surprise me. He's pretty blunt about this, and other presidents have done that in the past. President Obama did that in the Citizens United case a number of years ago. He said he thought the court had made a mistake. And the president's been pretty vocal on Twitter, or not on Twitter, but on social media, right, and calling out the court because he thinks they were wrong and he's unhappy with what they did. So it wouldn't surprise me if he does that. I don't think he'll dwell on it for a long, long time because there's a lot of other things to talk about.
Okay. All right, Ernie, mindful of what has happened, what does President Trump need to tell the world at this point?
Well, if he can dispense with all the political angle and all this, and just go with I'm saying go with economics. Tell the Americans that we're going to make this the strongest economy going. Now he's saying something that has not been true. This is the greatest economy ever. Well, it's not. We grew at, as I said, 1.4% in quarter four, as annualized and seasonally adjusted in the fourth quarter of 2025. That's not the greatest economy on the globe. It's not even the greatest economy in this hemisphere. So.
Okay. Justice Kavanaugh had mentioned that overturning the tariffs would cause a mess. Everybody's just talking about that. I think, just mindful of the viewers, which we always are, the big question right now is, what can businesses and consumers do to get back on track here?
Well, the consumers purchase and consume, and they buy the cheapest, best product out there, whether it's produced in another nation or produced in our nation. That's the good for the economy, good for all concerned. Now, what businesses have to do is, unfortunately, they have to gauge what they think is going to happen in the coming months. And I will argue that I certainly don't know, and I would argue that I'm not even certain Congress knows, or even the President knows what is going to happen. You've got to remove the egos involved and go with economics, economic policy. It's called the law of supply and demand, the law of supply and demand. It's not called a good idea. I mean, I'll leave it with that. I mean, come on.
So, Carson, he said, remove the egos, right? What on earth? I mean, how do we even begin to take those steps to make sure that we are having our consumers and our businesses feeling a little more confident about what's going to happen here?
Well, I don't know. I think the president he has a big ego, and he thinks he's right about tariffs, and I don't imagine that he's going to change. So it would take a change, and bigger changes in the I mean, let me say this. The president thinks he's right. He's not a total dogmatist, so if things were clearly blowing up in his face, I think he would do a course correction, but I don't think that he thinks that's happening yet. I think that there's still, in his mind, there's time for things to play out, and he ran, I mean, this is one of the things that he's thought about for a long time. I mean, President Trump, or Donald Trump, was not all that interested in a lot of the issues that candidate Trump emphasized when he ran for president in 2016, but tariffs and trade is something that he's talked about since the 1980s, as far as I know. So it would take a lot for him to move off of his policy on this, I think. So I think he'll try to stay the course using other statutory authorities.
How does all of this impact the midterm elections?
I sort of doubt that it will have that much impact.
Really?
I mean, what will affect the elections is whether the economy is doing very well or not, and whether they feel it.
What I'm saying is this hubbub is going to hurt the economy, so it will not be good. I mean, was Hoover correct in before the Great Depression? No, he was clearly wrong in terms of implementing tariffs that really pushed the economy. It didn't push the economy into the Great Depression, but it certainly did not help. It hurt the economy. This is hurting the economy. If not for the tariffs and the trade and the retaliation, it's not. I mean, if we could raise tariffs unilaterally, it wouldn't be as bad. But we don't. We have retaliation. China retaliates. Canada retaliates. Right now, Canadians don't want to go on vacation in South Florida. I mean, in other words, they pull back.
Okay, we have 3 minutes. Go ahead.
I was going to say that all may be true, but I just mean to say that I don't think the ruling will affect the elections that much. I don't think most voters are going to vote one way or the other based upon what the court said. They'll vote based upon what they're feeling. Yeah.
Okay. And looking ahead to 2028, either of you want to look that far ahead? Same thought?
Well, yeah. President Trump won't be there running for a re-election. He'll be out, but this policy, it goes against Republican, if you want to call it dogma. The Republicans have been historically more trade friendly. The Democrats are the ones that have been opposed to free trade. They're much more restrictive in terms of trade. So I mean, it's odd that for example, Democrats have always been much more opposed to immigration. They've always wanted restrictive immigration more so than the Republicans. Now it's switched, and I don't think that is good for the vote. If you're going to win elections, I don't think that's good. I mean, look at our population growth. That's another scary one. That's another something that may come about from the Supreme Court as well.
Okay, talking about the state of U.S. tariffs today. We have just a couple minutes. I want to give each of you 1 minute for final thoughts. Carson?
We'll have to watch what's going to happen. I think, as I said before, and I'll say it one more time, there are alternative legal authorities the president can use, and I expect he will try to find them. There might be some interesting details to emerge because he may not be able to do as much as broadly as he thought he could do under the IEEPA, but I think he'll keep trying, and we'll have to see how it works.
Okay, thank you. Ernie, what about you?
Well, I think keep an eye on, I mean, this sounds very economic centric, but keep an eye on the 10-year yield on the 10-year Treasury. You can go to finance.yahoo, it's right there, 10-year Treasury. When that yield goes below 4%, if it does, the economy is slowing down, and you better take heed. If it goes above, say, 4.5 up toward 5%, that's too much inflation. So move in there. Right now it's 4.05, 4.05 of a percentage point. That's in the good zone right now. So watch that number. I'm all about the economics, and watch the trade. The trade numbers are going to probably get better. And we looked at, as I said, the last number, the deficit was larger, not smaller. I mean, when you keep doing something, it keeps not working. I quit doing it. Mm-hmm. I'm seeing people in Washington, only in Washington do politicians push, and what they're pushing for is not working. Yeah, they continue to push that way. Again, I'll say it again. These are laws of economics, not good ideas.
We're all just going to keep watching, and as with so much else, only time will tell. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being here today, sharing your time and expertise. We appreciate it. Who knows, we may have you back here sooner rather than later, but thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cathy.
You bet. Thanks to our students who are working so hard behind the scenes, and of course, to all of you for watching. We'll see you next week.
Consider This is an issues and information program produced by UNO Television in the School of Communication. More information and program archives can be found at nebraskapublicmedia.org/considerthis. If you'd like to share your comments about this program, call the UNO School of Communication at 402-554-2600 during regular business hours. Or send an email to cwyatt@unomaha.edu.